All right, so here are the tests we have written for posting a genre. You can see in all these tests, we have a fair amount of duplication. Except the first one, in every test, we're generating an authentication token. Look, we have repeated this line here, and the other tests. Also, the request that we're sending to the server looks very repetitive in each test. There's only a small variation. For example, in one test, we may want to set the name to a short string or to a long string, or we may want to remove the authorization token, but the rest, the body of this request, the general template, the general structure remains the same. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you a technique to refactor these tests. This is my own technique. I didn't read it anywhere in any books or on any posts. So let's call this Masha's technique, Masha's refactoring technique for writing clean and beautiful tests. So let me show you how this technique works. On top of this block, we're working on this suite. So this is how it works. We define the happy path, and then in each test, we change one parameter that clearly aligns with the name of the test. It may sound a little bit ambiguous, but trust me, it's actually very easy. So let's define the happy path first. What is the happy path? Well, here we have a test for the happy path. Here is our happy path, right? So this is the template we want to extract and put it somewhere else. So I'm going to cut this code here and just add a to-do comment so we come back to this. So on top of this test suite, here, I'm going to define a function. Let's call this execute. So we're executing this request, okay? This function includes this code. Okay, now here we want to return the response, so let's return it immediately. And also because we're using await, we should add async here. So now with this simple refactoring, we can go back to our test, and where I left this to-do comment, we can simply call the execute function, await it, and get the response. Now in this test in particular, we are not working with this response, so we can delete it. Now, let's go back to our first test. Let's refactor this test here. Should return 401 if client is not logged in. So look at how we are sending this request and compare it with what we have here. The only difference is on this line where we set the authorization token. So technically, we can replace these few lines with a call to our execute function. We await it and get the response. But before calling this, we need to get rid of this token. Now we can pass this token as a parameter to this function, but I'm personally not a fan of passing parameters around because that's a very old and procedural way of programming. So I would rather to define this token as a variable in this block, token. Now here, initially token is undefined, and we're going to come back to this in a second. But back to our test, in order to test a scenario where the client is not logged in, we want to explicitly set the token to an empty string. So in this test, we don't have a token, but in other tests, we do have a token. So we should set this token to a valid JSON Web Token before each test. If you look at other tests, the first line of every test has this line. This is repetitive. So we can extract this and put it in the before each function for this test suite. So I'm going to cut this from here. Back to our suite. Let's define before each. We give it a function. And here we simply set this token. Now make sure to remove this constant. Otherwise, here you will define a token with a different scope, but we're working with a token that is defined at the test suite level. So remove the constant. All right, now, before each test, we are initializing token to a valid JSON Web Token. And in this test in particular, to simulate the scenario that client is not logged in, we explicitly set the token to an empty string. Now our test is only 3 lines of code. It's very clean, very clear, and what we have here clearly aligns with the description of the test. Now let's take this technique and apply it to other tests. So here's the second test. We should return 400 if genre is less than 5 characters. Again, we replace these few lines with a call to our execute function, await it, and get the response. Now, what is the scenario we're testing? Genre less than 5 characters. So similar to the token, we can define genre as a variable in this test suite. And then we change this variable in each test. So this is where we define the token. Let's also add the name of the genre. Now here in our execute function, we have hard-coded this genre. We should get rid of this and set the name of the genre in each test explicitly. So here I'm going to change this to name, or in ES6, we can make this code shorter. So if the key and value are the same, we can just add the key. Okay. Now in before each, we want to set the values for the happy path. So we set the name to genre 1. Now back to our test. So in this test, we want a genre that is less than 5 characters. So we set the name to 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, look, only 3 lines of code. And what we have here clearly aligns with this description. Let's move on to the next test. This time we want to test if genre is more than 50 characters. We don't need the first line because we initialize the token in before each function. Now here, we're setting the name, but remove the constant. Otherwise, this will be a different constant with a different scope. So delete. Now we replace these few lines with a call to our execute function, await it, and get the response. Beautiful. Now for the last 2 tests, because we're only dealing with the happy paths, we don't need to modify the token or the name. So we can simply delete this line, execute the request, get the genre, and make sure it is in the database. And the same goes for the last test. We don't need to set the token, and we replace these few lines with a call to our execute function. Like this. Let's make sure this refactoring works. So save, back in the terminal. Beautiful. So let's recap. We define the happy path, and in each test, we change one parameter that clearly aligns with the name of the test. So this is our happy path. We defined this execute function. Before each test, we set these parameters, token and name, to valid values. And in each test, depending on what we want to test, we modify one of these parameters to simulate a scenario.